right. And my Zoom camera is above me with a ring light around it, but you guys are down below. So I'm trying to kind of balance the both because I know you guys are on screen here, but I do want to talk into the camera. Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome. Uh, Happy Memorial Day weekend. Welcome to the first in a series of online talks that I am going to curate and give. I think I'm going to do them probably once every 2 months or so. We'll see how it goes and pick a different topic and hone in on that. This week, as you guys know, this month, I should say, is entitled Psychedelic Churches, Risks and Rewards. Um, I want to say at the beginning that my idea around doing these is to create more of a discussion atmosphere around it, kind of like the fireside chat kind of label and what that entails. This is not a formal presentation, although there are slides that I will be sharing with you guys. I don't want it to come across as just like an academic, formally curated presentation on Keynote that is pretty linear in thinking. While there are some slides to support some ideas, this is more of a discussion. And towards the end of the talk, I'll open it up for discussion and questions that anyone might have. We can certainly make this a roundtable of sorts. If you have any input, any questions, any concerns, any rebuttals, any support, please do let me know. My idea for wanting to start with this topic is twofold, really. One, I do have a lot of experience with psychedelic churches myself as a facilitator. So that's one. Some of them very positive and some of them not so positive. Number two, the rise in popularity of psychedelic churches across America, I think, is something worth really taking a look at. There is no official tally of how many psychedelic churches there are in America, but it's in the hundreds, maybe even in the low thousands, but there are hundreds of psychedelic churches operating in America. As I said in the write-up, if you got the email for this event, this is not a forum for me to endorse specific psychedelic churches or to not endorse or to drag into the mud specific psychedelic churches. Like I said, I have worked with some and have not had good experiences, and I've also worked with others and have had good experiences. But I'm not going to be calling any specific psychedelic churches out. It's not really the point of this. The goal is to have an open, community-oriented discussion on the pros and cons. One thing about the modern psychedelic movement that I am quite fond of is this idea of ceremony, this idea of ritualization, this idea of gathering into community to kind of create a community-driven, mystically oriented psychedelic experience that could be on an individual level or on a group level. At the same time, we've also seen the rise of the medicalization movement, right? Which is certainly has some benefits, I think, in terms of combating mental health and changing the discussion around mental health and ushering in a new conversation. And, I do think the medicalization / mental health revolution of psychedelics has brought people into the psychedelic ecosystem that previously probably wouldn't have been interested in psychedelics. So I do think kind of the halo effect of the medicalization movement has helped bring new people in. But in some ways, there are pros and cons to the medicalization movement, but there are certainly, as far as the mystical and spiritually inclined aspect of the psychedelic experience, which I think is kind of the default position of the psychedelic experience, goes by the wayside. And that really is the biggest problem I have with the medicalization movement is the sterility of it. It's the stripping away the magic and turning this into a medically kind of oriented procedure, if you will, and kind of handing over the keys to the psychedelic kingdom into gatekeepers that are, you know, part of certain power structures or capitalistic or authoritarian power structures, um, which is probably a topic for a whole other talk. But psychedelic churches, you know, we do want to start there. So I am going to quickly share my screen here a little bit. Um, it is hard to go full screen and also do this. So, you know, psychedelics have been a part of human, you know, human storytelling, human society, human culture for as almost as far as written history goes. You probably all know about the stoned ape theory. There are cave paintings in Tassili, Algeria that go back 9,500 years. There is archaeological evidence that supports the human relationship, especially with mushrooms, that goes back a really, really, really long way, right? And because of that, you know, I think it is really important to um, understand the symbiotic relationship between the human experience and plant medicines. And that's kind of why I want to make that point. I think plant medicines, the psychedelic experience, is part of us. It is woven into our DNA. But the earliest, you know, kind of organized indigenous structures that use psychedelics in a ceremonial and or medicinal and or healing oriented and or spiritually inclined way, um, you know, these were kind of examples, and we see here the Eleusinian Mysteries, Tiona de Cal, the Shipibo tribe in Peru, and so on and so forth. You know, these examples, I think, were probably closer to representative theological indoctrination rituals than they were um, just kind of, uh, mm, you see, that's what happens. Than they were, um, you know, just using the compounds without any, you know, without any kind of attachment to the spiritual world. I apologize that you can't go full screen and also let people into the Zoom room at the same time. It gets really hard. So, you know, in some respects, you know, the earliest uses of psychedelics were kind of churches in a way, you know. And if you look at indigenous structures and indigenous traditions and the thinking around the shaman, you know, the shaman was the spiritual leader of the community, the healer, the priest, the wise man, the doctor. And it was kind of a multidisciplinary way of looking at the relationship between psychedelics and humanity, right? And the separation between religious and spiritual enlightenment wasn't really separated from the use of psychedelics. It was kind of all woven in into one kind of slipstream of engagement, you know. And it wasn't until much later when uh, the kind of the fall of the pagan lifestyle and pagan churches and and multi-theistic and non-duality kind of religions kind of gave way to more monotheistic Judeo-Christian structures, like in the form of the Crusades and the early first, second through fourth centuries and things like that, that really kind of stripped away more esoteric relationships with the divine and with spiritual contact, which included psychedelic use. And if you fast forward that several hundred years later, you can really see that very evidently shown in Spanish colonial structures in Mexico and in South America, who really looked at psychedelic and indigenous psychedelic use as kind of a demonic form that was kind of blasphemy in a way, right? But all of the kind of the early examples as we see with indigenous use that even translate into modern indigenous use as well, with ranging from the Shipibo tribe to Santo Daime to the Native American church and everything and everywhere else in between. These were kind of church structures in a way, right? There's a great book out there called Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. Really, really, really good book by Mike Marianacci. I highly recommend it. We're going to kind of fast forward a little bit, but this is around late 19th century kind of relationships with peyote. Still, the modern world required some form of organization for the peyotists. They had been under fire from Christian authorities since Spanish colonial times, and U.S. government suppression began in 1896 when the Bureau of Indian Affairs, misidentifying peyote as the mescal bean, instructed its agents to seize and destroy any quantity of the plant that appeared on American Indian reservations, since the medicine was interfering quite seriously with the work of the missionaries. That kind of tells you a lot, right? And there are other accounts of this that go back about 300 to 400 years earlier of Spanish settlers in Mesoamerica, Spanish colonialists who kind of thought the same thing around mushroom use, that it was getting in the way of the serious work of Catholic missionaries. And so they had to wipe it out. So in 1918, James Mooney, who was actually a white guy, drew up the Articles of Incorporation for an organization that would unite American Indian peyotists under a single body. Its stated purpose was to foster and promote the religious belief of the several tribes of Indians in the state of Oklahoma in the Christian religion, with the practice of the peyote sacrament as commonly understood among the adherents of this religion, and the several tribes of Indians in the state of Oklahoma, and to teach Christian religion with morality, sobriety, industry, kindly charity, and right living, and to cultivate a spirit of self-respect and brotherly union among the members of the native race of Indians, including therein the various Indian tribes in the state of Oklahoma. So on October 18th, 1918, representatives of the Cheyenne, Otoe, Missouri, Ponco, Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache tribes signed and filed the papers of incorporation in Oklahoma. The Native American Church was born. The church grew quickly, and by 1922 was estimated that it had about 13,000 members. Several state branches were incorporated as well, and over 50 American Indian nations had organized peyote groups under its authority as a religious corporation, right? So that is pretty cool, right? Pretty interesting. That the formal kind of creation of the Native American Church only goes back to 1918, right? And if you think about that kind of logically, right, it kind of does make a lot of sense, right? The modernization of America, this is kind of the peak of the industrial age, kind of settling into the post-industrial age, but really the peak of railroad expansion and commerce and industry and ecological threats, and prohibition was also starting around the same time in America with alcohol, and early iterations of the war on drugs had begun. The Harris Narcotics Act of 1906 kind of already passed, and in the late 1900s, there were certain conditions put around opium use due to the Chinese Americans who came in to build the railroads on the West Coast, who were bringing opium in. And so there were certain kind of fabrics of the drug war already kind of shaping up with those examples, prohibition, opium, and things like that. But it didn't have the full breadth of the war on drugs, as we saw later on in the 20th century. So it does make sense that in the early 20th century, Native American groups, various tribes as well, which I think is really interesting, got together, leaders from these various tribes to protect the indigenous use and the sacramental use of peyote specifically. And that went on for quite a while. We're going to get into the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the RFRA, in just a little bit. But that went along kind of well for the next 80 years, but not entirely. So fast forward, though, 50 years into the 1960s. And again, I do apologize for not sharing the screen full screen. It just gets very tricky with Zoom to operate both. I don't know why. But, the 60s, a lot when the counterculture movement was really kind of starting to take formation as the counterculture. In the early 60s, what we now refer to as the 60s and the hippie movement and the counterculture really didn't have a shape, really didn't have an identity. It was kind of closer to the beatnik revolution than it was what we now refer to as the hippie revolution. But starting in the mid 60s, a lot of psychedelic use, including stuff by Timothy as well, the League for Spiritual Discovery, what was going on at Millbrook, Art Kleps, who lived at Millbrook, whoever might need to mute that, formed the Neo-American Church and then the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Timothy wrote this book, Start Your Own Religion, which led to the League for Spiritual Discovery. The Boohoo Bible, which is the Neo-American Church Catechism, was written by Art Kleps, which served as kind of the sacred text for the Neo-American Church. All of these examples used psychedelics and claimed that they were the sacraments of their church, but it didn't really take legally. It didn't really stand. Both Timothy and Art Kleps and all sorts of other characters, ranging from Ginsberg to Kesey and Rosemary Leary and so many other people in between, did come across a lot of state, local, and federal authoritarian crackdowns on this idea that they could use these sacraments under a religious umbrella, right? So it didn't really have, they tried, and to some success, I think it was kind of, I think the 60s, what was so great, especially about the early counterculture movement, was that it was really kind of this idea of this utopian fantasy, creating a better world, better living conditions, and really kind of, thinking for yourself and cracking down on authority and really rebelling against the conformity of 1950s America and, the kind of conformity Judeo-Christian alcohol and tobacco mindset that really was dominant throughout America. So it is kind of interesting at the 60s twists, like a lot of these organizations were churches, not in the same way that we look at them now, but in some ways they kind of were. But then we fast forward to the early 90s. And in 1993, this was in rebuttal to a case that happened in 1991 when two Native Americans employees were fired for their peyote use, and eventually and denied their workman benefits, the workplace benefits, and things like that. But this eventually led to what is now referred to as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and passed in 1993, signed by President Clinton. The law restored the strict scrutiny test for religious freedom cases, which means the government cannot substantially burden a person's religious practice unless it demonstrates a compelling government interest. and proves that it is using the least restrictive means possible. The government cannot sustainably burden a person's religious practice. Right. Now, that is a really interesting concept. And I think that is at the heart of the psychedelic church movement today and kind of the main thread of how we should embody it, which I can certainly talk about in a little bit. In 2006, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the UDV church could import and use ayahuasca for religious purposes. The court said the government had not proven a compelling interest in banning its sacramental use. In 1909, in Oregon, a federal case, the Santo Daime Church was granted legal protection to use ayahuasca under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? So both the UDV and Santo Daime Church and the Native American Church are probably the three biggest, I'd say, largest and most populous indigenous organizations operating under America that have RFRA protection and do and operate using that protection and operate pretty successfully doing that as well. So under the RFRA, groups can argue that their use of controlled substances like ayahuasca or peyote is a sincere religious practice protected from government interference. The government must then prove that banning that use is necessary to achieve a compelling interest like public safety, and that there's no less restrictive way to do so. So again, is a sincere religious practice protected from government interference, right? So fast forwarding to today, I'm going through the 20th century into the 21st century very, very quickly, just so we can kind of get into the heart and the meat of the discussion. But the question we have to ask ourselves today, are all psychedelic churches operating from that intention, And the answer is no, of course not, right? I don't think that is the case. And why not? Well, the RFRA, has created this federally kind of protective bubble that allows psychedelic churches to be created and to operate. And because it is so easy to get a religious exemption and to start a church, it has become the Wild West of the psychedelic frontier. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of psychedelic churches operating in America. Now, I do want to kind of push back and contradict myself a little bit, and, I'm not trying to get into cynicism here or kind of downplay a lot of the sincerity of the great psychedelic churches that are operating there. But again, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, the RFRA truly religious and civil liberties blanket of protection that allow us to use these sacraments that are so important and special to our personal and spiritual growth? Or is it just a legal exemption to start a psychedelic retreat center? So it's really the Wild West, right? Hundreds of psychedelic churches, completely unregulated. There is no oversight or overarching organization to rate and to supervise the psychedelic churches in operation. None. Anyone can start a psychedelic church. There are even legal groups out there who have a church in a box model, which I know of a couple that it costs about $5,000 and they will send you everything that you need to start a church. Send it in the mail, walk you through the entire process, and it's literally a church in a box model. File the papers, name your church, and all of a sudden you have RFRA exemption. So going back to the earlier points, about the Native American Church and how the RFRA is defined, groups can argue that their use of controlled substances, federal or state or local governance, is a sincere religious practice protected from government interference, right? So if you're using the RFRA to start a psychedelic church, does that make the person who starts the church a spiritual leader? Does that make them a church leader? You know, um, by definition, by the legal definition, yes, it does. But from a practical and pragmatic definition, and as it relates to the administering of psychedelics, I think we do get into murky waters here. I'll go back to the slides in a second. But, you know, I'm a cognitive libertarian kind of by default, you know, and I really admit that. I believe that everyone should have the power, the God-given power to change their consciousness as they see fit, the power of personal choice, the power to connect with God in any way that you feel is best for you, as long as you aren't harming others, right? And when that comes to the world of psychedelics, I think that really falls in line with that, especially around natural psychedelics, the absurdity of passing laws and making a fungus or a plant that grows indigenously across various parts of the country into a Schedule 1 drug. It's absurd. I mean, that's just the fallacy of the American experiment, of the authoritarian experiment, of authoritarian structures of late stage capitalism and so on and so forth. And it's also kind of the fallacy of, when well-intentioned religious beliefs turns into dogma and turns into control and turns into power, like in and of itself, you know, I have no problem with religion. It's usually the institutions that ruin it. It's not the religion itself. It's not the yearning to connect with God. It's not the belief in whatever it is that you want to believe in. And so the morality that has kind of permeated from kind of right wing, super conservative uh, biblical fanaticism, certainly has made its way into our view on intoxicants as well. Not to mention a lot of other social justice issues as well, the prison industrial complex and things like that. So, for the last 70 years or so, I mean, really the last 60 years, America has, spent trillions of dollars fighting this war on drugs thing. And it is an abject failure on all levels, So back to the point, when it does come to using psychedelics as a way to get closer to God and to feel closer to whatever it is that you want to feel closer to, or to heal yourself, or to really pierce those veils of reality to see what's on the other side and have a new perspective for how to live in this world. For me, there is no law or policy that really makes a difference in my eyes, right? But so when it comes to these churches, these psychedelic churches, right? I find myself contradicting myself a lot, right? Because I don't believe in gatekeeping. I don't. I don't, in any stretch of it, in any context of gatekeeping at all. But psychedelic churches, I mean, like I said before around cognitive liberty, as long as you aren't harming others, right? So, it does beg the question when we get into psychedelic churches, right? And really, if we look around at so many of them today, what are they? You know, are they luxury wellness retreats? Are they deeply spiritual ceremonies? I think results may vary. Um, and based on a lot of the experiences that I've had working as a facilitator with psychedelic churches, I'm going to kind of start with some of the issues, and then kind of go into kind of the brighter stuff a little bit later. And again, these issues, these aren't about, um, again, it's not my intention to roll specific organizations under the bus or anything like that, to call people out. But I have personally seen a lot of abuses of power and serious safety concerns within the psychedelic church space. Not only have I seen it, but I have come across so many stories. When researching my book, I ultimately in my book, there was a lot more in the book around psychedelic church misuse and the abuses of power and things like that. But ultimately, a lot of that got cut out. Some of it's still in there, but um, did a lot of research, talked to a lot of people, received a lot of letters, and also have witnessed a lot of stuff. So I'm kind of start at some of the more complicated, difficult issues. So psychedelic churches and basically operate as a psychedelic retreat for the most part, right? They are usually 3 to 5, sometimes 7 day destination events where you go to a location that is usually pretty nice, well appointed, well accommodated, very good food, yoga, body work, cold plunges, stratostropic light therapy, all the stuff. And they operate more like kind of wellness retreats than they do spiritual congregations, I think. And thus, because of that, they are very expensive. Not all of them. And by the way, I'm not referring to all of them at all, but they're very expensive. So, I do see a lot of profit first, ceremony second. Second on the list, and this is an extremely problematic one. By definition, when you start a spiritual organization of any kind, whether that is psychedelic, whether that is Christian, Judaism, Scientology, it doesn't matter, Hinduism, yoga, Buddhism, it creates by default a kind of a cult of personality around the leader, right? Psychedelic churches are no exception to that. Time and time again, I see people who start psychedelic churches who get into the role of being the leader and taking on the cult of personality and wearing the robes and really playing the part of ecclesiastical leader, right? Sometimes that can go very well, and sometimes it can go horribly bad because it creates a serious power imbalance and it creates cults. This is how cults begin, right? It's just how it is. I've seen egregious practices of it, and I've seen really just kind of borderline use of language that really isn't too big of a problem, but does kind of hint at it. Like at the end of ceremony, like church leaders telling all the voyagers, welcome back. You are no longer initiates. You're now part of the family. Welcome to the family. Kind of language like that, that is subtle kind of culty indoctrination, that you're now part of this exclusive family, and you're no longer initiates and you're part of something now, Um, third on the list, and this is highly problematic. It also goes into number 4 too. Church leaders who have no formal psychedelic facilitation training by any of the leaders or of the space holders, right? And this goes into the next one, evangelization that kind of muddies the waters, right? So what this looks like in practical terms is somebody goes on a psychedelic retreat or has a psychedelic experience, whether it is an ayahuasca retreat in Peru or a psychedelic church here or a mushroom experience here, and their life was completely changed, right? They had a magical experience out of just one or two ceremonies, um, and immediately decide, this is what I want to do. This is what I need to do to change the world. And thus, and in and of itself, that sounds great, right? It's really great to be so influenced by psychedelics that you want to bring the healing to others, right? But oftentimes, a lot of church leaders skip some steps, They get highly evangelized and just so inspired by the plants that they immediately just open up a psychedelic church and feel that they are qualified to do so because their life was changed by it. And they have no formal experience, no formal training, no safety protocol training, no harm reduction training, no all of kind of the basic kind of 101 requirements of what being a safe, compassionate, and effective facilitator is all about, um, and the problem with that is when you start doing retreats, you know you are calling in a population oftentimes that is extremely vulnerable, especially in relationship to mental health these days, right? Psychedelics and mental health. So a lot of people who are in very vulnerable post-traumatic states and kind of have a lot of psychic fragility to them are giving their authority over to these psychedelic retreats. And a lot of them are just very poorly run, and don't have the basic fundamental building blocks of safety and well-being structured into them. And like I said before, end up charging an awful lot of money for people to be there, right? And I've seen a lot of this, far, far too much of it. Um, Too many to name. And for me, it's really disheartening. Um, one example of where I have kind of seen that kind of abuse too kind of turns into dosage protocols and how that turns into psychic harm. I think a lot of people who get very passionate about psychedelic churches and end up starting them are usually people who have had their lives so changed by psychedelics that they juxtapose what happened to them and the way that they did it onto others. So I've seen a lot of dosage protocols at psychedelic churches that are egregious, to say the least. The first timers who are doing heroic doses and kind of being forced to do them too, not really given a choice in the matter, no discussion, just saying, this is our protocol, take it, you're going to be fine. And I think that is kind of a slippery slope. So again, the summation of this is using the RFRA as kind of a loose legal shield, to operate kind of loosey-goosey psychedelic luxury retreats that don't really have any formal therapeutic kind of alliances in place that are filled with kind of the best and worst of humanity. So many great people certainly get into the space and do amazing work and really want to heal people. But it also invites in a lot of bad actors too, because the barrier for entry is so low. It's non-existent. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. The barrier of entry is to start a psychedelic church. It does take some money. Of course it does. But not that much, and so, the gates, the barrier of entry, and the ability to start a psychedelic church and create a website and advertise yourself on Instagram as a psychedelic authority is a pretty easy thing to do. There's a much darker side to it, of course. Uh, there's a lot of research out there and journalism on the darker side of the psychedelic renaissance. Mata Busby has written a lot of stuff about it and has given a lot of talks on it, on sexual abuse, financial abuse, abuse of power and mental manipulation, abuse of vulnerable populations, even deaths at some retreats and things like that. Highly dangerous dosage protocols, no medical screening with ayahuasca retreats that leads to medication interactions and people dying. Um, all of these things, while not super common, they are common enough to have a discussion around it, and I think very much worth noting. Um, there are things, you know, I haven't seen anybody die myself. I have seen some people kind of have some psychic breakdowns and leave the retreat further destabilized than when they came. Um, and I haven't witnessed any sexual abuse myself, but I know of many people who have and who have experienced it, and not only experienced it but witnessed it. So there's a lot of validity to kind of the darker side of this as well. Something definitely worth talking about.
We're
So
talking to Fireside about, so you used to sign the prints. And then we're only like,
what's that?
whatever you do, like after the year, yeah.
I think somebody needs to mute. Okay. Yeah. So, what like I was saying at the very beginning of this talk was that, what I want to do, and I hope to do long term, and to make public on my website and create kind of a lot more documentation and free kind of distribution of documentation to people who are curious, is to kind of help create a guidelines for psychedelic church selection for people who are looking to attend psychedelic churches, and to kind of create a spiritual, scientific, medical, energetic, high vibe, high intentionality kind of screening process for how someone might want to select a psychedelic church, right? Um, Again, like I said earlier, one of the kind of the biggest problems around psychedelic churches is that they are presented as luxury retreats, you know, and they're very, very appealing. They're very, very appealing. They're great to look at. They're really comfortable. They're really nice kind of destination kind of retreats, right? Um, and that looks from a marketing perspective, as we all know today, none of us are immune from the algorithm. None of us are. As much as we like to say we have it in check, the algorithm is really, really strong. The medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan said. So when you get marketed to, and you are psychedelically curious and you are newer to this space, the marketing is really powerful stuff, and the marketing can hide all of the deficits. It's like, who wouldn't want to spend, or who wouldn't want to go on a luxury Aspen psychedelic retreat with, hot tubs and gourmet vegan cooking and massage and body work and yoga every day? Sounds great, right? I mean, sure. So that is kind of one overarching aspect that I don't quite have it fully figured out, but worth talking about. So some basic 101 questions. Who is the church leader? Who is this person? And why are they doing it? Like I said before, there are many, many people in this space doing beautiful work, truly doing beautiful work, who are really here, who are operating out of a place of integrity, who really want to bring kind of the sacred container and integrity of the medicine to more people in a safe and loving and spiritually inclined environment. So that is kind of the criteria. which I think you should look at if you're looking at a psychedelic church. Who are these people? Why are they doing it? And I would also dive in a little bit deeper. What are the qualifications of the leaders and the space holders and the facilitators? Do they have any formal training? If so, what is it? Of course, do they have personal psychedelic experience as well? What is their approach? What's their harm reduction protocols? What are their safety protocols? And just really understanding kind of the lineage that these people come from. There's many great contemporary lineages that aren't tied into indigenous structures, which is totally fine. And there are many great indigenous traditions as well who are training new shamans and new curanderas to do beautiful work, but really digging in deep to find out more about who these people are and what is it that they do. For everyone on this call, this may sound pretty like basic stuff, but do they offer preparation and integration? Like real preparation and integration, or are they just rushing you into the ceremony? What is the dosage protocols for the church, and are they mandatory? Like I said before, I did witness some dosage protocol, what I thought were some dosage call violations that I thought were pretty abhorrent and pretty abusive. And the church leaders gave the Voyagers no other option. Like, that was the only way. They said, well, you could do this or you don't. And so I'm really, as a facilitator myself, I always believe in meeting the client where they're at. Um, if they only want to do 2 grams and everyone else is doing 6, that's okay. It's just kind of meeting the client where they're at, listening, not forcing our agenda or our wills on them. So that's a good question to ask. Safety protocols. Should something go wrong, do the facilitators and the space holders and the leaders have a safety protocol? Do they have experience with harm reduction when trips get challenging and when maybe they go sideways? Kind of like what Zendo Project does, but on a retreat level. Do they have that in place? What's the cost of the offering? This is a big one. Like I said, so many of these retreats are really, really, really nice. These psychedelic churches are really nice. And so what's that cost? And is it worth it to you? Do you have the money to be able to do it in a comfortable way, or are you sacrificing your livelihood just to be able to do this? And I think this is an important one. How many voyagers are participating in the ceremony? And what is the ratio between facilitator to voyager? The common classic example is, of course, Soul Quest in Florida, where, more than one person has died there. But, on any given night, dozens and dozens and dozens of people doing ayahuasca. Rhythmia in Costa Rica. I said I was going to talk about specific organizations, but I slipped. Rhythmia in Costa Rica, they can have upwards of 50 to 70 people drinking aya in the ceremony and having one shaman and just a few helpers. That feels a little disproportionate to me. And these are more kind of energetic, non-tangible questions that we could also bring into the conversation as well. Do you personally feel drawn to the church leader? Or are you doing this out of convenience or your kind of preconceived notion around the legality of the psychedelic church, right? And that's kind of an important one and something I hear a lot. We have to really make clear that the RFRA is not a 100% blanket legal protection for psychedelic churches. It does not mean that they are operating 100% legally. It's definitely a loophole. The chances of local law enforcement going to the retreat to bust it up is pretty low. There aren't too many cases of that happening. Um, but, so I don't want people to misinterpret kind of the legal structures around this. Um, and, are they, so do you feel energetically in alignment with this church's offering? Or are you going just because it looks nice, because aesthetically and externally it looks nice? But deep inside your heart and your soul, do you feel like in alignment with this offering? What do you know about the church's past offerings? Um, Based off of what you know about the RFRA, do you feel the church is in alignment with that mission, right? Is it priced fairly? Does the offering feel luxurious to a fault? Who knows? These are all things to talk about. But I think going back to kind of the original wording of some of the RFRA's kind of by definition, the governing laws that the RFRA is supposed to induce. Groups can argue that the use of controlled substances is a sincere religious practice protected from government interference. So that's what I mean when I ask is, do you feel that this church that you are going to is in alignment with that? Is it truly a spiritual congregation where you're getting together to explore a spiritual paradigm and engage in a spiritual method? Or is it just a luxury retreat that uses psychedelics and uses their RFRA as a legal loophole to be able to do so? And hey, look, like I said before, this isn't about gatekeeping. If psychedelic churches are doing that and they are using the RFRA as a legal loophole and they really aren't spiritually centered and it really is just kind of a luxury wellness retreat, but they do so safely and they aren't harming anyone, I guess I don't really have a problem with that. It's not really for me to judge. That's also not for me personally to go to or to recommend to others. I do think that the practice of taking kind of this religious sacrament seriously, if we are going to be calling it a psychedelic church, is an important thing. It's something that we should really honor and deeply kind of give reverence to. Um, so that is my belief system around it. It's a really complicated issue because there are so many psychedelic churches out there, and you know, too many to count. And I think a lot of people have heard of some pretty, pretty salacious stories and around them. And a lot of people have had also a lot of great experiences as well. But I think as a community, and this is definitely something that, like I said just a few minutes ago, I do kind of want to hone in what I think are some guidelines and some kind of suggestions for the Voyager around selecting psychedelic churches. Also, maybe this is a little bit too authoritarian. Who knows? I don't really have it worked out. But I do wish that there was some kind of community driven, not government driven, community driven kind of seal of approval for churches that can, where people can go and view and witness and maybe take part in these offerings and kind of see, hey, are they safe? What are the dosage protocols? What's the preparation and integration look like? And kind of give it some kind of stamp of approval. What that looks like, I have no idea. But that's kind of my utopian vision for it. I do wish that, there was kind of a community driven, kind of overarching body that could kind of give these churches a stamp of approval, maybe like an extension of like, I don't know, the Zendo project or something, just to make sure people are doing it safely. Anyway, I've talked for about an hour. Does anyone have any questions around or comments? Trip.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for giving that talk. That was really amazing. Um, so what I wanted to say is kind of like something I've been working on with a friend of mine who's a programmer and trying to put it together in a website is similar to that and is essentially a non-denominational spiritual gathering of people. And so the idea is that people will post what their spiritual beliefs are, the ones that they're comfortable sharing on the website with a social media style profile page. And then specific churches can post what their individual beliefs are. And then through that, it'll be sort of like a matchmaking process to help people find an entheogenic church that aligns best with their personal beliefs. And based on what you went over, I realized that there could be a whole lot more added to it
Hmm.
to help them decide which church might fit them the best. And this kind of spurred from me being a member of entheogenic churches since 2017, starting with the trying to join the Native American church, not being 21 years old yet, and being told that I couldn't because for them, and it is sort of like a legal risk, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate. They guided me to the Rastafarian church because they were like, well, they'll let you join. And there ought to be a few people in the Rastafarian church that can talk to you about these LSD experiences that you've had that are spiritual. At the time, I was a member of the Presbyterian church, right? And there's just no one that I could talk to there about this stuff. And then I ultimately switched from them to the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, which I know you're well aware of them.
Sure. Yeah.
From Alex and Allison Gray. And there's a whole lot of stuff I like about their organization. Of course, they're not perfect. Everybody has flaws with what they do. But I was a follower and member of COSM for several years. And while I was a member there, I ran into legal issues for possession of Iowa or the Mimosa hostilis plant, right? And this is still an ongoing legal battle for me to try to fight some state charges that are getting transferred to federal charges. Not sure 100% why, but probably because of the state finding out I was going to use a religious defense and not wanting to deal with it. But so through this, I have looked at some other churches and joined a few other churches to try to see if any of them align more with my own beliefs, namely the International Church DMT, which focuses on the continuous infusion, IV infusion of DMT.
Yeah.
Based out of Colorado. And that's where I really had my first shocking experience of like, maybe this isn't an ethical church, because everything was like really great with them, speaking with them. And then when they found out that I had these pending charges, they were like, okay, well, we can't let you participate in any of our ceremonies. And that kind of got me thinking, well, how confident are they with their religious defense if they're not letting somebody with pending charges participate?
Mm-hmm.
And all of that's kind of what led to me being like, all right, I just want to focus on individualized spirituality more than trying to like tie myself down to a church.
I appreciate that, Trip. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. It's a wealth of knowledge that you have for sure. Yeah, a lot of things came up for me in hearing that, but I love the idea of like you're warming to the idea of kind of creating a portal that allows people to help find what's right for them. That's really awesome. And yeah, I think Alex and Allison Gray, like COSM, is a pretty great organization. They use the church moniker pretty well. Of course, nobody's perfect. And uh, also the idea of this kind of off topic, but what you were saying, which I forgot to mention in my talk, in my presentation, but that the idea of what's a sacrament and what isn't. I think churches that, like UDV or Santo Daime or Native American Church, so ayahuascas and peyote, traditional plant medicines that have lineages that go back, hundreds of years, that kind of makes it the church model a little bit more palatable. But what about the synthetics? What about LSD and MDMA, and ketamine and synthetic DMT and things like that, I know churches that do MDMA journeys, and there is no precedent for that whatsoever at all. And I do think one day that probably will backfire. But who knows, man. But yeah, thanks, Trip. Thanks. Appreciate that for sure.
And I just want to add one thing and I'll be
Yeah.
quick, I promise, so other people can talk. But the synthetic thing, I have a great analogy for that off of Christianity, and it's to look at God commanding Noah to build the ark out of gopher wood. And so he modified a tree into something that was not natural. And so I see synthetic entheogens as valid for that reason, that
Yeah.
it is a modification of something natural in some way.
I do too. I do too. And this is a concept I've been playing around with a lot and given talks, which I'm pretty fond of, is that as far as the synthetics go, especially LSD and MDMA, we are the indigenous culture. We are the indigenous culture for LSD and MDMA. We're the ones who are creating the story that will be told hundreds of years from now. And just because they are synthetic doesn't mean we can't use them ceremonially or religiously or spiritually or mystically, So if you gather together in community and use the synthetic compounds, by all means, 5-MeO as well, it's, use these things with your heart and know that, we're the indigenous culture for them. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? You could jump in or use the hand raising feature, whatever you want.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, I've looked at this church model for a couple of years. I'm in Colorado. I have a lot of experience with psychedelics personally and then with clients. But my personal journeys have been spiritual, deeply spiritual. And I think every client I have, I sort of guide them into a spiritual journey in some way, but not everyone is spiritual. So when you mentioned making sure or looking at, like, if you're going to do a church ceremony, what are the previous offerings of the church? I mean, I'm not a nun. Well, I was a longtime Buddhist for 35 years. Psychedelics actually shifted me back towards God-oriented spirituality, but I'm curious about that. Like, how do you start a church if you don't have past offerings as a spiritual teacher?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a kind of a chicken and the egg question, isn't it? Right? How do you get, if you create a church and you want to start from the beginning, right? That's a very good question. And every church has to start with retreat number 1, right? You got to start somewhere, of
And
course.
I've done retreats, just by the way, but it's just like, I don't want to lie and like rewrite my past, you know, group journeys as something other than they have been. I'm from Aspen. I'm in Denver now. So
Yeah.
I'm very familiar with that model, and it kills me because I know how much they're making, and I could do that. I could go there and do that. But I'm just looking at like what's the right thing, for me. And the spiritual is where I don't want to disconnect from. And that's why I kind of have been consistently attracted to the church model.
Yeah.
But like I'm not a minister. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a Native American. I'm not, a nun. I am a Buddhist. I was.
No,
I'm a
I mean,
deeply spiritual person,
I resonate a lot with it because I'm similar. I'm an initiated Hindu and take my lineage and very seriously in my spiritual practice very seriously, and I do bring that into my ceremonies that I do one-on-one. And I take it very seriously. I consider it to be my offering because Ram Dass was my teacher and my mentor, and I want to bring just a smidgen of that to what I facilitate. So I've thought the same thing about, and the retreat, the psychedelic churches I've worked with, I bring that into it. But you're right, everyone's got to start somewhere. Yeah, I mean, for me, it just kind of comes down to an intentionality. It doesn't have to be like a certification, or like you're a minister, or you're initiated this or initiated that. For me, because I dogma and spirituality don't have to go hand in hand. Just it comes from, to me, it's an attitude of authenticity and integrity and open-heartedness and taking it seriously. Not just doing this to you know use the RFRA as an excuse just to have a luxury retreat, just taking it seriously in some sort of way, and that comes in Baskin Robbins 36 flavors, whatever it is, it's a million different ways to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not about money. I mean, like
No.
nowadays I make way less than I made a couple of years ago before it became, legalized and everything. And not legalized, well, regulated and
Yeah.
but it's not about, if people can't pay, I don't even charge them, just like that's fine. But it's really more about why go down the church route as opposed to just being, an LLC and a facilitator. I'm wondering about the real advantage. I know the disadvantages, like if
Well,
there was ever a crackdown and they discover, okay, you're not really religious or spiritual, then I don't
well,
want
I know
to.
people in Colorado who, even though the Natural Medicine Act was passed,
Yeah.
who are still going the church route because they don't want to deal with the regulatory headaches of Prop 122 and setting themselves up to be a healing center. And I know many people in Colorado who are like, yeah, it's great and it's decrim, but I'm sticking with the church model. It just allows me to do it with a little bit more freedom.
Yeah.
So
That's what I was thinking. Okay.
yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a little more freedom. So most often, and on this conversation, we're thinking mostly of new churches that have sprung up as sort of mushroom churches, if you will, and that sort of thing. But just to mention, there are a couple of significant organizations among both Jews and Christians organized around the entheogenic use of psychedelics in a religious context. The Jewish organization is called Shefa, SHEFA. Their website is shefaflow.org, I think. And the Christian organization is called Ligare, Ligare.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they were both formed from people who were part of Johns Hopkins Religious Professional Study, who had among the most powerful religious experiences of their lives. But along with the Church of Ambrosia or whatever, there are these mainstream major religions. Another woman who was a part of this study is looking to organize a Muslim group as well. So we have that to look forward to. And if you are a Christian or a Jew, by all means, look into it. It can be a new dimension in your faith.
I love that. No, thank you for sharing that, for sure. No, that's absolutely. Yeah. And there's that story going around of the minister who participated in the Johns Hopkins study, the divinity study, who was he Methodist or Presbyterian? I forget his exact affiliation. Someone probably here knows, I'm forgetting, but he got his collar stripped for participating in the Johns Hopkins Episcopal. Thank you, Elaine. So, but yeah, I know of those organizations, the Christian one especially, and thank you for that. Any other comments, questions?
Hi, Zach. It's Brad.
Hey, Brad. Good to see you.
How you doing? Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for presenting this. It's a very topic that's near and dear to my heart. Paul, are doing a documentary on psychedelic churches, and ever since we started it, things have changed so much that it's kind of interesting to see how it's evolving in both good ways and bad ways. But my concern is that, since it is the Wild West, and there have been, gratefully not too many deaths and not too many horrific things happen, but it's just a matter of time before more of that happens, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm just concerned about this going in front of the Supreme Court the way it is now, and being heard, because I can just see people saying, "Oh my God, they're taking our children away from Christianity and into having them take drugs, and then somehow putting the kibosh." I don't think they could put the kibosh on it, and I hope they never do. But it's just a concern, because I don't think we saw it coming up in the 70s, in 1970, when Nixon put the kibosh on it. The genie's so far out of the bottle now, it'd be a lot harder to put it back in. But it's just a concern that I'd voice. So thank you.
I am so with you. As I see kind of this rise of psychedelic churches, and people, they're taking a lot of risks, especially and it's how it's marketed and advertised. I mean, I see paid ayahuasca retreat promotions on Meta, on Instagram, putting ayahuasca in the ad, and Bufo in the ad, and it's like a paid, Instagram ad, and being very public about it. And I'm like, oh, God bless you. But I thought, I was thinking about the same thing recently. Like, goodness gracious, given like what's going to the Supreme Court these days, like all it takes is one person to raise the flag and take it all the way up. I think it could get pretty challenging. I hope that's not the case, but I'm with you. It's a very legitimate concern, man. But glad you're here, Brian. Anyone else? Comments, questions? No?
Zach, I have a.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, because I'm talking with a friend who's considering the LLC route. Sorry, I'm outside in the dark, Kayla here. But a friend who's considering the LLC route versus starting up a psychedelic church, and they have the funds and so on and so forth. But based on the conversation today and what the previous woman was saying about her route with the LLC and trying to look at the pros of the church, you definitely highlighted on them well. But I guess what really is concerning to me is how you said, if you open up and you're like, oh, here's my wellness center, then they know like exactly where you are to go find you and investigate if they, want to do that. So I don't know. And with everything in our PSI class, talking to the people who are out in, Colorado and still not operating above because of those limitations, I know there's not really any real answer, but perhaps LLC might be the best way to go for a little bit longer.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe. Pros and cons. I hear you. Yeah. I don't know.
Thank you, though. Very informative. Wonderful so far.
Thanks. Yeah, I think did someone else have something?
I want to comment on two things.
Yeah.
One is that I happen to know a little bit about the LLC versus church thing, which is that the only exemptions are granted to churches thus far. And that's because there's this, I think we're stuck in this paradigm of churches being what we recognize as religious. And at the same time, there's the concept of the traveling minister. And there's people who offer ministering services. And so I think it would be great that we see more individuals who offer ceremony. But you really couldn't start a church unless you have a congregation and you have regular worship. And those are like the key components. I think that would be the distinction between the two.
Yeah. In my eyes too. That's what I say. Yeah, totally.
And so what I'm seeing is the problem. I'm an executive director of a nonprofit that is an association of churches that use sacraments that are controlled substances called Sacred Plant Alliance. And once you start to build that community, now you have a community that you have to manage, and you have positional power and the possibility that there is this exploitation. And how do you do ethical complaints? And how do you engage in a process of restoring someone who's made a mistake, or what
Mm,
happens if you want to kick somebody out. It is so complicated
yeah.
to run a church and be part of a community and lead a community, more so than anyone thinks. And where I advise a lot of people on starting their churches, they're like, oh, I just want to be a church. I'm like, well, you're then potentially a corporation, and you
Yeah.
have a board, and you have meetings, and you have financial records, and you have to pay your ministers and their employees. And they think we're just going to slap church on it. But it's a whole ass business with a whole community of diverse people with very complex issues.
Yeah, no doubt.
So,
No doubt. I think I really appreciate that. And your organization is great. You guys do great
oh,
work. I
thank
love it. I
you.
know you came in a little bit late, but I
I did.
was
Sorry, my kids were going to bed.
no, all good, all good. But yeah, I was you know, one of the rubs I was kind of talking about earlier is like, well, just slapping this idea of the church thing on it when really they aren't churches at all. They're just luxury wellness retreats, but they're calling it a church and they're using the RFRA perhaps a little too liberally. I don't know. Maybe
Well,
it's
I
not for
think
me to judge, but I do see it as kind of a pretty loose.
it's that RFRA protects the individual. So if you
Right.
aren't a church, you don't have to call yourself a church. You can just say it's a religious practice.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's an important distinction for sure. Yeah, when one thing, this isn't like a total parallel, but it's something that I refer to a lot. It's like for those of you who are from California and you before California went recreational with cannabis and it was still medical, if you all remember, I know Brad's from LA, if you remember the end of the medical movement and you remember the guys on Venice Beach dressed in funny green costumes selling you a medical card for $50. Oh, your leg hurts. You can't sleep. Here's a medical card. And to me, it was kind of making a mockery of the medical movement. I mean, hey, I did it. I did it. I got my medical card too when I had no legitimate reason to do it, but it was kind of making a mockery of the whole medical cannabis thing, and that's how it towards the last 5 years of it, that's what it was like, the whole Venice Beach craze. It was just ridiculous, that it was even called medical at all, you know. And I don't want to see that happen with the psychedelic church thing, That's what I don't want to see happen. Yeah, just leave it at that.
Is it one more thing?
Yeah.
Just to back on what Allison said, and I love what you said earlier about having some sort of community-driven seal of approval.
Hmm.
Lance, we've been having multiple conversations over the years about how can we have some sort of, not gatekeeper per se, but just some sort of body to deal with bad players in the field, because we have to kind of watch out for ourselves. So outside government and law enforcement doesn't have to step in for us, lovingly. And I know there's places like the Conclave that does that for 5-MeO to an extent, and I think it'd be a really good idea just to get a conversation going with some leaders in the community to see, what can be done. Can we have a council of, that can make decisions? Can we have a roving ombudsman on call to take complaints? And, I know there's not a lot we can do about bad players in the field, like naming them publicly without opening up for litigation, but I feel like something has to be done because there's so many bad players out there doing tremendous harm to people. And, as a psychologist, it just tears me apart because I feel like I have a duty to warn. And I hear about certain things and I try to warn people as much as I can without getting sued. But it's such an important issue. And if we want to protect this precious renaissance or whatever you want to call it, then I think we need to get more involved in terms of overseeing it. And again, not just policing it, but just, offering people a path to redemption or some sort of mediation process if that's suitable for that. But right now it is the Wild West. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
And,
I love that idea, and on all the levels, and I'm this isn't the forum for that, but I am no stranger to making mistakes, in my facilitation practice, when I was not in a good place, I'm one of those people, I don't consider myself to be a bad actor, but I've made mistakes, and I've been held accountable, I understand that. So, but as far as bad actors go, Brad, if you go down further down the road, please keep me informed. I'd love to know more about it.
I will do. Thanks.
Brad, if you want to talk, that is what Sacred Plant Alliance does, and holy woe, is it a heavy lift. We are an association. We have self-regulation with our own ethics principles and guidance and a reporting mechanism. So members of communities of churches can report to the Sacred Plant Alliance. And so we have a structure like that. And we've dealt with some complaints over the last few years, and it is so hard. It's so hard. And we are actually about to commence with a public effort, like an educational outreach effort of things that we've learned of sort of like what are the potential situations that can come out and what are the most concerning things to look for. And yeah, it's pretty well.
But even I was talking earlier about marketing, and how marketing is such a seductive player in the whole church and psychedelic retreat movement, that even on a superficial level, if there was a way to kind of get into the gestalt, hey, having a Sacred Plant Alliance stamp, literally physical stamp approval on the website, to me, I don't know, I would like to help people learn that, hey, that means something, that makes a difference, maybe it's just cosmetic, I don't know, but it means something, I don't know.
It does, it can. Certification brings along with it its own responsibilities too, right?
Yeah.
So if we certify our members and, became something that justified, almost like guaranteed in some way, that they were good, we can't say that. What we can say is Sacred Plant Alliance members are committed to improving themselves and betterment. But, we had talked about visiting each of our members and sitting with them to see how it felt.
Yeah.
We didn't have the funds,
That would take a lot.
Yeah. It's also kind of weird because if you have a congregation, do you want visiting people who's
Observing, right?
who may not align? It's a very culture specific practice.
Allison, if you do that, you almost have to do it randomly because I mean, a food critic doesn't tell the restaurant he's going to the food.
It's like the Michelin Guide. Yeah, it's the Michelin Guide. It's done secret.
Yeah, as someone said to me, with great power comes great responsibility, and it's hard. So I mean, what I hope to see is more churches creating their own spas. I don't want it to just be Sacred Plant Alliance. I hope there are many others that do what we do, and we're actually going to start to release everything we do internally as well because we want other people to replicate it.
I love that. Thank you.
Suing the DEA, but so yes, we're really spread thin right now. But I hope that other people try this. I mean, even amongst solo practitioners, to just be able to check in once a month and be like, something happened.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be shameful of it. I'm going to just share that I did something wrong or I'm concerned about how this went. Can I get feedback? It's the peer support and consultation.
Love that. Well, thank you everyone so much for your time and your insight. Really appreciate this dialogue. Very, very, very much. It's a really important topic, and so many people doing great work in the community, Brad and Allison and so many others. Thank you so much. I know there are a few people in here who have already taken my course, so it doesn't apply to you, but my course starts again in December. If you're interested, please ask me questions anytime. You're always welcome to write me, but visit the website, take in the information, see if it's right for you. It's a lot of fun. A couple recent graduates are already in this room tonight, so it doesn't apply to you, but that starts again December 10th. And otherwise, we'll do this again in October, and we'll pick a different topic. Thanks so much. And I am going to post this on YouTube for greater dissemination, because this is an important topic and a lot of great issues were raised. So really appreciate it, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Yeah.